Hi there, Brian Harrison here, aka Professor Cloud. We're here in this video to talk about a service that isn't really talked about a lot by Microsoft or really anybody, and that's Azure DevTest Labs. It is a really cool feature of the cloud that allows you to build an isolated environment that can be used for any number of different reasons for things like development, research, even testing, where you need a temporary environment that can be isolated away from, say, production, and you can perform whatever you need within that environment and then tear it right back down again. You can also give control over it to your testers or to your developers as need be. Now, the DevTest Labs is actually split up into two distinct services, the DevTest Labs and Lab Services, where Lab Services is more of a classroom type scenario, and that one I discuss in a second video that you can find on the same YouTube channel where this video is currently hosted. It's also a part of a blog posting on my website, www.theprofessorcloud.com, and you can find the blog posting there, and that blog actually does contain links to both videos as well. So let's dive into this and take a look at what this particular feature actually contains. Let's talk first of all about the use cases. I mentioned them very briefly, but let's dive into each one of them. For DevTest Labs, you can leverage infrastructure as a service or platform as a service to create development environments. And when I say development environments, it could be something as simple as one distinct solution that your developers are all working on different parts of and deploying in very much a microservices type manner. And therefore, that is the shared development environment that they actually push their code to. Or it could be something even smaller where every single developer has their own solution that is self-contained, and they are actually continuously redeploying that solution and doing their own individual testing. All of that can be done inside of a development environment where this environment is completely isolated away from production. You can also, therefore, give access and control to the developers to spin their own virtual machines or PaaS services up as need be, but you can also lock that down for cost control purposes. DevTest Labs is also fantastic to be a test environment where you either want to do a big bug bash for your existing application where someone's found an error and you need a whole bunch of people to try and replicate it. Maybe you need to do performance testing, or maybe you've implemented a new feature and you need to do some integration testing or things along those lines in order to get your application really up to snuff to then be pushed into your production environment. Lastly would be sandbox research. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the cloud is ever changing. Microsoft, for example, is pushing out new features and new functions every 3 weeks, depending upon which feature you're focused on, sometimes even more rapidly than that. Well, how do you make sure that it is a feature or a function that's going to be relevant to you or relevant to your software, relevant to your applications and systems? That's where DevTest Labs can really come into play, where you can spin something up, implement that new feature or function, try it out, play around with it, see how it's going to integrate with your applications or environments, and then do that all in an isolated area where you don't have to worry about it implementing or doing things in production. All of these use cases are supported by available policies and schedules for when VMs or PaaS services can be made available to developers or testers. And then with the use of policies, a level of control can be given to the development team while still keeping your costs down. And I've talked about this, and I'm going to continue to talk about it more, especially when we dive into the demonstration portion of the video. Here are some of the available features. This isn't all of them, but some of the available features that you're going to get by leveraging Azure DevTest Labs. It's an isolated environment, as I talked about, based on either infrastructure or platform as a service-based scenarios. And when I say it's isolated, I mean it gets its own virtual network. That as long as you don't peer that virtual network with anything else, will be completely self-contained and locked down. It can be associated with either marketplace images or one-to-many image gallery scenarios where you are leveraging infrastructure as a service, but you have your own images that you've created that you want your developers to build on top of. You can also choose from a curated list of resource manager templates, which are authorized by the team lead or central IT to be used by your developers, whether they be ARM templates that contain app services, databases as a service, or any other number of platform-based services. All of that can be deployed using resource manager templates. You can then also set up policies for auto shutdown and auto start schedules for your VMs, and then determine who's going to manage those schedules. Will it be the team lead or someone from IT, or should it actually be the developers themselves? DevTest Labs also enables central IT to control waste, optimize costs and resources, and stay within budgets by specifying how many resources are each user allowed to have, or the entire lab as a whole allowed to have. And then you can set up connectivity to other peer networks for shared resources, such as databases or storage accounts, where maybe your developers are only working on the user interface for a particular application. You want to keep the data static. You don't want them messing with that data, so you put it in a shared environment that's managed by, say, one database administrator, and then the developers only work on the integration points with those pieces of data. Now, I did talk about this a little bit. What are the differences between DevTest Labs and lab services? And obviously, if you want more information about the lab services themselves, definitely take a look at that video, because I do go into more depth there, or make sure to read the blog post article. Lab services, first of all, is infrastructure as a service only. And that's very important to know, because DevTest Labs absolutely implements platform services. Lab services, a single VM is assigned to the students that are part of the lab. Whether it's a bug bash or whether it's a classroom environment, you only get one VM per student. That VM access is available only via a RDP or SSH proxy, and that proxy is determined by the lab itself. You have no control over it. The lab administrator turns it on, and it's just available. The cost and security is controlled by the instructor, and is very limited in scope, meaning that these labs are designed to be up for hours, at most days at a time, and then immediately torn back down or created anew for the next time that a course is created. In DevTest Lab scenarios, though, it's much more configurable, because these labs could be up for the entire development cycle or the entire research cycle of a particular project, which could be potentially months, even potentially years. In addition, we already talked about that the VMs are assigned to students in the lab services side. The developers actually have the ability to create their own VMs and their own environments inside of the DevTest Lab scenario. So DevTest Labs, at the end of the day, more configurable, more capable. Lab services are for defined lab scenarios, such as course teachings and things of that nature. Now, just as a last piece before we go into the demonstration portion, here's a reference architecture for what a lab environment might look like. In this particular scenario, the company has an infrastructure subscription where they're maintaining centralized pass-through of all traffic, where they can actually run the traffic through things like intrusion detection, intrusion prevention, potentially running it through some other web application firewalls or so on, and then allowing access into the virtual networks of the labs via peered VNet connections. In the business unit subscription 1, you actually have a lab that does contain platform as a service as well as VMs. So you can see things like web apps, SQL, resource groups, machine learning, and so on. Whereas the other labs are just there, but they are all part of one big virtual network. I, however, recommend that not be done. That each team lab set up have its own virtual network, and if they need to be peered, fine, but I do not recommend putting in multiple labs inside of the same virtual network. That opens you up to potentially security, cross-contamination, or privacy concerns. In any case, this is just a reference architecture. This is an example. You can obviously spin it up and create it however you see fit. Lastly, if you should have any questions or concerns or would just like to have a discussion about Azure Dev Test Labs or anything related to Azure, here are some of the ways that you can get in contact with me. You can definitely connect to me via Twitter. You can get to me via LinkedIn messaging. If you want to learn about some of the other things that I have done education work on related to Azure, you can go to my website that I mentioned earlier, www.theprofessorcloud.com. I also do a lot of game streaming, and you can find me on twitch.tv /theprofessorcloud. And please, if you just want to drop in and say hi and ask me an Azure question while I'm playing whatever game I'm playing, you're more than welcome to do that as well. Hope that you found this valuable. Look forward to talking to you when we get to the demonstration portion. Okay, let's take a look at what the Dev Test Lab actually looks like within the scope of Azure itself. And we're going to start here by looking at my Dev Test resource group. In this resource group, when you actually spin up a Dev Test Lab, you actually get 3 distinct resources. Now, you're going to see 4 of them here in my listing, but 3 of them were automatically created at the same time as the lab itself. The first being a storage account that can be used for things like logging, auditing, and things of that nature. The lab, of course, itself that we're going to take a deeper look at here in a second. And then a key vault. And this allows for your developers to actually store secrets that are then going to be used within the scope of their application for security reasons, for things like passwords, for example, or connection strings that a developer would typically want to make sure was encrypted within the scope of their application, thereby allowing you to not have to spin up a separate key vault for each individual developer, but have one that can be shared across the entire lab. And in a development scenario, that's actually still more secure than what a lot of other development groups also have in place. Now, you're going to see one additional resource here, which is a virtual network. The virtual network is a shared virtual network that is then peered with the lab's virtual network and can therefore be used for shared resources. But you could also have used that as your primary virtual network for the lab itself, and then maybe have a separate virtual network that would be peered like we saw in the reference architecture. Let's go ahead and take a look then at the lab. So the first thing that you're going to see when we go into the lab itself is you're going to see a lot of information here in the navigation for my resources, because the default view for a Dev Test Lab in the Azure Portal is from the view of the user, not the view of the owner. So any virtual machines that I as a developer would want to use would be here under my virtual machines. Any platform as a service environments that have been defined via a Azure Resource Manager template would be defined here under my environments. My data disks, that's fairly straightforward, thereby allowing me to actually attach and detach data-oriented disks to different virtual machines on the fly when needed. My secrets, we just talked about that. This is where I'm going to store my encrypted passwords, connection strings, and so on within the shared key vault of the lab. And then any personal data that we might need to store can be relevant here. But this is just relative to me as a developer, and this is what your developers would actually take a look at. Right now, you're not going to see anything here because I don't have any that are created in order to keep my own personal costs down. But what's important from the perspective of using this within your organization or within an organization is the configuration and policies. And this is where the actual owner of the lab is going to set up things that are going to be relevant to making sure that the development environment can be leveraged to its fullest, but that it can also be locked down and cost controlled, making sure to keep your development teams under budget when if all possible. So the first thing is you need to make sure that you do have activity log or auditing turned on, and auditing is turned on inside of the portal by default, but you will need to make sure to set up settings so that the log files can be pushed to, say, your storage account or potentially a log management tool such as Log Analytics, or maybe even a third-party system like Splunk or Logstash. This will allow you to know who it is that's doing what within the scope of the lab at all times, and then, of course, allow you to do reporting and alerting on top of it. We then look under the settings. This is where things start to get really important from a security and control perspective. The first is, okay, who is going to be supporting this lab? Do you want to set up support messages so that someone can, within the development team, actually request help relative to the lab environment? Next is then when we're going to start setting up actual controls or lockdowns. The first is what allowed virtual machine sizes can be made available. And if we scroll down here, you'll notice that I have only set up A2 and A4 VMs as being allowed VM sizes. And these are very old VM types. But they are also very inexpensive. You can actually define this based on all of the available VM types that Microsoft supports today. Today we would want to be using the V2 versions or potentially the D versions. Either the V2s, maybe even the B1s. The supported and not supported is actually relative to whether or not they support premium disks. Then we can set up how many virtual machines are allowed per user. We can also set up the number of virtual machines that can be allowed for the lab as a whole. So what is the limit? And then what are the limits of the number of virtual machines that use premium OS disks? This is not something that's typically done, having been someone who's built virtual machines in a cloud environment for many, many years. The operating system does not normally need a premium disk or an SSD, but it can. It depends upon how many reads and writes it's going to actually be performing. And then on the data disk side, if it's going to be used for databases, then having it be a SSD is going to be very, very powerful and is going to increase performance. Next then is the lab settings, and this is an overall set of settings that you can specify for what's going to be placed in the lab. So, for example, any virtual machines that get created, any platform as a service architectures, should those resources be placed in the same resource group that the lab was created in, or should all of the virtual machines be placed into one resource group, at which point you have the ability to specify the same or a different resource group from the one the lab was created in? Should there be environment access, meaning should ARM templates be made available to the different users within the scope of the lab? If so, do they have reader rights or contributor rights to the different environments? In other words, can they create their own? And then how should remote desktop connections be made available to the actual virtual machines? I mentioned in the lab service comparison to DevTest labs that there is a defined proxy for remote desktop and SSH connectivity to the virtual machines. You actually have control over that connectivity to some degree here by specifying a gateway host name and a gateway token. There is then an announcement that can be set up for the lab itself that can be sent to individual users when you allow them into the lab. You can also set up browser connectivity through the virtual machines to your different environments using a Azure Bastion service. So if you would rather use that rather than setting up a direct connection to the virtual machines, you can make that available. There's a new preview feature called Identity. We're not going to talk about that because it is still in preview. Next then is schedules. And this is where your cost controls really come into play. If you are going to be tying your lab to virtual machines primarily, you can set up an auto shutdown schedule. And this is going to be based on time zone and the available time. And then do you want to also send notifications? Those notifications would get the messages based on the lab announcement information. And you can specify a webhook URL or an email address for where those notifications will go to. You can also set up auto starts. And if you do allow an auto start, same thing. You can specify the start time, the time zones, and then specific days of the week that you want to have them actually timed, actually spun up. The auto shutdown, on the other hand, is going to be a daily reference to a time. The start will give you the option for either daily or weekly. And then with respect to a shutdown policy, Do you want to allow users to set a schedule and opt out of that schedule? Do you want the users to set a schedule but not be able to opt out? And then do you want the users to have no control over the schedule and instead that schedule be set by the lab owner or lab administrator? By default, you're allowing the users to set a schedule. My personal experience, based on having implemented this at a number of different types of organizations, I highly recommend having the user having no control, especially if you know that your project is going to be very budget constrained. Next is external resources. So we talked about a number of different capabilities that users can spin up inside of this lab, whether it be virtual machines or ARM templates, thereby allowing you platform as a service capabilities. But in some instances, how are you going to get access to those ARM templates? Where do those ARM templates come from? And that's where we start with things like repositories, where you can actually define GitHub and Visual Studio Online or Azure DevOps repositories that can be then made available inside of your lab for ARM templates. They can also be made available for what are called artifacts, which are installables that you need to be made available for either the applications or the virtual machines that your developers are actually using, leading into mandatory artifacts. If there are specific things that need to be made available, whether they be zip files or executables or things of that nature that need to be made available for the virtual machines as part of your application, as part of your configuration process, then these can be made available inside of the lab as well, rather than the developers having to go outside to a public source. We also talked about creating virtual networks that can be made available either for use by the DevTest lab or as a peered network to be storing shared environments, databases, and so on. And that's where you're going to create the connectivity to a specific virtual network, and it's going to request similar virtual network information. If the virtual network is already in the subscription, you'll obviously be able to find it fairly quickly and easily. Next then is for virtual machines specifically. Where do the images come from? You can actually specify which marketplace images from the default public Azure Marketplace are available for your developers to create virtual machines off of. And you can search for them here and then just add a checkbox next to each one of them that you do want to make available, and those will be the only ones that a user will be able to build off of. But these are going to be all of the basic images. You then also can attach a shared image gallery from your subscription that may contain custom images that your developers need to build off of. So that's something else that, especially in a federal government scenario, financial services, healthcare, where every one of you happen to have compliance requirements for any virtual machine that gets deployed in production, you want to make sure that your developers are building your software on top of those compliant images rather than just building off of the base Windows image and then hope that all of the additional configurations and security controls are not going to break anything. Custom images, you can actually add individual images directly to the lab as well. So rather than attaching to a gallery or marketplace, if you only have, say, 1 to 5, then just adding those individually will work as well. But you'll have to have a base image already in your subscription that you can easily pull from. That's either a Linux or Windows-based image. Next is reusable bases or formulas. There aren't any in this one, sorry. Very similar to a custom image. A formula allows you to build a base that is slightly different from the marketplace base. That already has maybe something installed on it, or that is going to run a particular script when it spins up, rather than just the base operating system, so that it will do some specific configuration. The formulas can then be used as bases for your virtual machines as well. And then lastly are your public environments. So based on the repositories that you've configured, which ARM templates are you making available for use for your developers to spin up environments. These are coming from the public environment repo that was set up by Microsoft. I have not configured the public environment capability for the one that I configured. But this is where you would actually add additional environments that a user could actually select in their My Environments area and actually spin up an architecture based off of that ARM template and the parameters that they provide. You can also specify disks, shared disks that should be used by your developers that may already have data, software, things of that nature deployed within it, and that make sure that they are encrypted accordingly. This is a preview feature, but it is something that you can absolutely take advantage of in the future. And then lastly, as I mentioned, a lot of the configurations that we talked about from the lab perspective are going to help you with both security as well as cost control. And if you do need, as the administrator or the manager of the lab, to be able to look at that, that's where the cost trend and the cost by resource reports are going to give you information based off of what you have deployed. Now, you're not going to see any information here because I don't have anything inside of this lab at the moment. But it is going to help by filtering out only the information related to the resources in this lab. Whereas if you go to the standard cost control reporting inside of your Azure subscription, it's going to give you everything and it's going to force you to do all of the filtering yourself. This is going to help you speed along the finding of how is the cost coming with respect to, or how is the budget coming with respect to this particular lab and the development team that might happen to be using it. So those are all of the features that are available for DevTest Labs. Hopefully you've seen the value of this for your development teams, for your research teams, for your testing teams to actually use in their scenarios, with their applications, with their projects that they might happen to be working on. At any point in time, please feel free to reach out to me through any of the standard means if you should happen to have any questions. I'm a big fan of this feature, and I really wish that Microsoft would actually do more marketing for it, because I think a lot of other customers and a lot of organizations would find it to be very, very valuable. Thank you very much.